One man shaped modern Europe from a single Swiss office. In 30 years, Alfred Escher accumulated wealth, political power, and influence that rivaled entire governments. Yet almost nobody remembers his name. While Rockefeller was consolidating American oil and Rothschild was financing continental wars, Escher was engineering something more ambitious: the complete financial and infrastructure transformation of an entire nation. He founded institutions that would outlive him by 166 years. He orchestrated a railway tunnel through a mountain nobody thought possible. He accumulated enough power to determine Switzerland's political direction almost single-handedly. But what most people don't know is this: his greatest triumph, the Gotthard Tunnel that finally connected Europe, cost nearly 200 lives. Italian workers, Swiss laborers, Austrian miners, all sacrificed to his vision. The tunnel opened on May 22, 1882. Alfred Escher died 6 months later, on December 6, 1882, at age 63, his body broken by the very project that defined his legacy. This isn't just the story of a railroad magnate. It's the story of how one person, born into privilege, weaponized that advantage through calculated ambition, political manipulation, and an absolute refusal to accept natural obstacles. It's a story about the cost of progress, not measured in dollars, but in human lives. It's about how innovation and ruthlessness are often inseparable, and it's a cautionary tale hidden in history books, nearly forgotten, except by Swiss historians and railway enthusiasts. By the time Escher died, he had created two of the most important institutions on earth: Credit Suisse, which would dominate global banking for over a century, until its spectacular collapse in 2023, and the Gotthard Railway, which opened entire continents to commerce and travel. He served in Parliament for 34 consecutive years. He was president of Switzerland's National Council 4 times. He shaped education policy, created the infrastructure for industrialization, and orchestrated international diplomacy that nobody knows about because he operated entirely behind closed doors. But here's the question that haunts his story. Did Alfred Escher build these monuments, or did these monuments build him, and then consume him from the inside? Let me take you back to 1819 Zurich, where a child born into unimaginable wealth began his climb towards unprecedented power. Before Alfred Escher died in 1882, he had already ensured his creations would outlive him by generations. Credit Suisse opened its doors in 1856 with a single mission: to finance Switzerland's railway expansion without allowing foreign banks to seize control of the nation's future. By the time Escher stepped down from its leadership in 1877, the bank had grown into the financial backbone of an entire nation. When he died, Credit Suisse was worth millions. When it finally collapsed in March 2023, to 141 years after his death, it had accumulated $5 trillion in assets across its lifetime, making it one of the largest financial institutions ever to fail. The connection is direct. The institution he created shaped European history in ways he could never have imagined. But where did Alfred Escher come from? Here's what most people get wrong about him. They assume he started from nothing and built an empire. That's only half true. Alfred Escher was born on February 20, 1819, into the Escher-Zoom glass family, one of Zurich's most powerful dynasties. The Eschers had wielded influence since the 16th century. His father, Heinrich Escher, wasn't merely wealthy. He was one of Zurich's most successful merchants. The family owned land, controlled trade routes, and moved in circles where presidents and princes gathered. In his childhood home, young Alfred didn't dream of wealth. He inherited it. This context matters because Alfred Escher's story isn't about rising from poverty. It's about inheriting advantages and then weaponizing them with unprecedented intelligence and ruthlessness. He was the perfect storm, a child born into a family network that opened doors combined with an intellect sharp enough to see opportunities nobody else recognized. He had the capital to invest, the connections to succeed, and the political position to shape laws in his favor. Most importantly, he had something rarer than money. He had the ability to convince powerful men that his ambitions were their ambitions too. From his earliest years, Escher was groomed for influence. His father ensured he received the finest education available in Switzerland. While other boys from merchant families learned accounting and commerce, Alfred learned diplomacy, political theory, and the language of power. He became fluent in French, German, and Italian, languages that would matter tremendously when he later needed to negotiate with French and Italian governments about the Gotthard Railway. At age 25, in 1844, a radical liberal politician named Jonas Furrer persuaded young Escher to run for election to Zurich's Grand Council. He won. This was the moment everything changed. Escher entered politics, not as an outsider fighting against the establishment, but as a member of the establishment, using its infrastructure to reshape it. Within a decade, he had become the most influential voice in Swiss liberal politics. By 1850, he was probably the single most powerful man in Switzerland, a nation that still had a century of democracy ahead of it. The gap between where he started and where he ended seems impossible to bridge. A young man born into existing wealth shouldn't by any logic become powerful enough to reshape national infrastructure entirely. Plenty of wealthy people throughout history had plenty of capital and completely wasted it. What made Escher different? What made him capable of orchestrating projects that seemed technologically impossible and financially insane? The answer lies in something almost nobody talks about: his understanding of leverage. Escher understood something most businessmen never grasp: that money is almost worthless compared to the ability to direct how others spend their money. He didn't build the Gotthard Tunnel by paying for it himself. He built it by creating a structure where government, private investment, and foreign capital all flowed toward his vision. He didn't found Credit Suisse by investing his family fortune. He created an institution that channeled other people's capital according to his philosophy. Between 1844 and 1882, Alfred Escher orchestrated the expansion of Swiss railways from a handful of disconnected lines into a coordinated network that integrated Switzerland into the European rail system. He didn't do this by working alone. He did it by building a network of allies: politicians, bankers, engineers, foreign investors, and positioning himself at the center where all their interests converged. When he moved, everyone moved with him. When he proposed a project, politicians approved it. When he needed capital, investors materialized. This is the method teased for the deeper chapters ahead. Escher didn't accumulate power through individual genius or revolutionary ideas. He accumulated power by understanding how money moved, how politicians thought, and what made powerful people willing to support ambitious projects. He was a master networker, operating in an age before networks became digitized. But to understand how he built this empire, we need to understand the historical moment into which Alfred Escher was born. The morning Alfred Escher was born, February 20th, 1819, Switzerland was barely a country at all. The Napoleonic Wars had just ended. The concert of Europe was being established by emperors and kings in Vienna. Switzerland, nestled between powerful empires, was attempting to maintain neutrality while determining what Switzerland even meant in this new world. The nation had no railroad. It had no modern banking system. It had no unified currency. What it had was mountains, lakes, valleys isolated from each other by impossible geography, and a long history of trading partnerships that reached back to the Middle Ages. Into this moment, Alfred Escher arrived. His birth was recorded not in a small household ledger, but in the official records of one of Zurich's most important families. The Eschers weren't new money. They had been wielding influence in Zurich for more than 2 centuries. The Zoomglas designation indicated they were the branch of the family that had achieved particular prominence. The name derived from a prestigious house in the old city that had been in the family's control since the 16th century. When young Alfred emerged as the first son, it wasn't an ordinary birth. It was a dynastic moment. His father, Heinrich Escher, exemplified the merchant aristocrat of early 19th century Switzerland. Heinrich hadn't been born into the family's wealth. He had married into it, joining the Eschers by wedding one of their daughters. But Heinrich possessed something nearly as valuable as the family connection. He possessed relentless business acumen. While many wealthy merchants in Zurich coasted on inherited advantages, Heinrich expanded the family's wealth through shrewd international trade, strategic land speculation, and careful positioning within Zurich's commercial networks. There was one undeniable dark shadow across the family's wealth that historians often overlook. The Eschers, like many Zurich merchant families, had accumulated substantial assets through participation in the colonial system. The family owned coffee plantations in Cuba. These weren't small agricultural ventures. They were substantial operations that generated significant income, and like all Caribbean plantations of this era, they were built on slavery. Young Alfred's childhood home, his education, his future opportunities, all were partially financed by enslaved labor in the Caribbean. This isn't mentioned in most hagiographic accounts of his life, but it was foundational to understanding where his wealth came from. By the time Alfred was old enough to think about the world, his father had moved the family into one of Zurich's finest estates. The young boy grew up surrounded by books, art, educated conversation, and complete economic security. He would never worry about money. He would never experience the desperation that drives most ambitious people. Instead, his ambition would flow from something more dangerous, the desire to prove that the status he inherited was justified, that he was exceptional, not merely fortunate. His education was designed to prepare him for power. While other Swiss children attended regional schools, Alfred was taught by private tutors in languages, mathematics, history, and political theory. His father ensured he understood how money moved between nations. His mother ensured he understood the social graces required to move among the highest levels of society. By age 15, Alfred was fluent in French, German, and Italian, a linguistic advantage that would prove crucial when negotiating international railway agreements decades later. What's striking about Escher's early years is that there's no dramatic moment of realization, no childhood trauma that forged his ambition. There was no schoolyard poverty, no desperate hunger for escape, no burning need to prove himself to his parents. His hunger was purely for power and significance. He wanted to matter. He wanted to shape things. And he had been born with every advantage necessary to do exactly that. In 1837, at age 18, Alfred enrolled at the University of Zurich. This was unusual for someone of his station. Sons of wealthy merchants often apprenticed directly into the family business or studied abroad at more prestigious European universities. But Escher chose to study at home, in his own city, which suggests either a desire to remain connected to his network or, more likely, a recognition that studying in Zurich placed him at the center of emerging Swiss intellectual movements. He studied law and political science with some of Switzerland's most influential teachers. These were transformative years. The 1830s and 1840s were turbulent periods across Europe. Revolutions had swept across France, the Balkans, and German states. Liberal ideas about individual rights, constitutional government, and representative democracy were spreading like fire through intellectual circles. In Switzerland, young liberals were beginning to challenge the conservative structures that had dominated the Confederation since the Napoleonic era. Escher, surrounded by these ideas and equipped with the confidence of inherited privilege, found his intellectual home among these radical liberals. By the time he completed his university education, in 1841, Alfred Escher had become convinced of one thing: Switzerland needed to modernize radically. The nation was industrializing while remaining geographically fragmented. The mountains that had protected Switzerland from invaders for centuries were now imprisoning it economically. There was no efficient way to transport goods from northern Switzerland to southern Switzerland. There was no unified system connecting Zurich to Geneva, Zurich to Basel. If Switzerland was going to compete in the emerging industrial economy, this had to change. The solution in Escher's mind was clear: railways. But Switzerland faced a unique challenge that other nations didn't face as acutely. Most national railway systems were built by governments. France had a national railway vision. Germany had state-backed railway companies. Britain had private railways, yes, but with an enormous domestic market to support them. Switzerland was small, mountainous, and poor compared to these powers. No government could afford to build a complete national railway system. Private capital would need to be mobilized. This insight became the thesis of Escher's entire life: that Switzerland's future depended on channeling private capital toward public infrastructure projects through carefully designed institutions. Banks would be created to concentrate capital. Railways would be built to knit the nation together. Universities would be founded to train the engineers and managers who would operate these systems. And one man, someone who understood both political power and financial leverage, could orchestrate all of this. In 1844, when Jonas Ferrer invited the 25-year-old Escher to run for Zurich's Grand Council, the young man said yes. He won his election easily. His family name and his reputation as an educated, progressive voice carried him to victory. But Escher understood something crucial that many young politicians never grasp: Being elected is not the same as having power. True power requires positioning yourself at the intersection of multiple systems: political authority, financial capital, technical expertise, and social networks. Over the next decade, Escher would systematically position himself at exactly these intersections. He would become the person who understood railways, understood finance, understood how to coordinate all three. By 1850, when he was still only 31 years old, he had already become the single most influential person in Switzerland's government. The question that drives the next chapters is simple. How? How did a wealthy young man born into privilege leverage that privilege into the complete transformation of a nation? The answer lies in what happened next. The beginning of Escher's real power dates to 1850, when he was still in his early 30s. By this time, he had already served several years in Zurich's Grand Council and was becoming recognized as a voice of expertise on economic modernization. But expertise and ambition alone don't create power. Escher understood something that separates successful politicians from merely competent ones. He understood that laws shape outcomes far more than individual effort ever can. In the early 1840s, Switzerland had no coherent railway policy. Some cantons had supported the construction of small rail lines. Some had opposed railway development as a threat to local autonomy. The result was chaos. A handful of disconnected railways that couldn't integrate with each other. Different companies used different gauges, different lines connected to different cities. There was no master plan. Switzerland was becoming economically fractured at precisely the moment when nations with integrated rail networks were gaining enormous economic advantages. Escher saw this as an opportunity. In 1852, at age 33, he worked behind the scenes to draft a railway law, a piece of legislation that would fundamentally reshape how railways could be built and operated in Switzerland. This law, approved by Swiss Parliament, established that railway construction and operation would be left primarily to private companies, not government. But here's the crucial part. Private companies would be licensed, regulated, and subsidized by the government. The government would determine broad strategy. Private capital would fund execution. This sounds obvious to modern readers, but in 1852, this was genuinely revolutionary. It created a framework where ambitious men with capital could build railways, but only according to a national vision. And who was positioned to direct that national vision? Escher, the man who had written the law. Immediately after the railway law passed, Escher founded the Swiss Northeastern Railway Company in 1852. This wasn't just another railway. It was strategically designed to connect Lake Constance, on the German border, to Zurich, creating a German-Swiss connection that had been geographically impossible before. Escher positioned himself as the company's controlling force. He brought in investors, wealthy merchants from Zurich, Basel, and other cities. He brought in political connections. He brought in technical expertise. But the vision, the strategy, and the coordination remained entirely his. By the time the Northeastern Railway was completed in 1855, it was the longest integrated railway line in Switzerland. More importantly, it proved a concept that you could coordinate massive capital, political pressure, and technical expertise to build infrastructure that seemed impossible. The Northeastern Railway was profitable. Investors made money. The Swiss economy benefited from the increased connection to Germany, and Escher's reputation was transformed. He was no longer simply a politician who supported modernization. He was proven to be a man who could actually build things at massive scale. The success of the Northeastern Railway brought enormous wealth to Escher personally. As a major investor and controlling shareholder, he received substantial dividends. But dividends were not his primary motivation. What mattered to Escher was influence. The Northeastern Railway proved that he could move capital and coordinate projects at a scale that seemed impossible. It proved that his vision worked. It proved that powerful people trusted him. This recognition of Escher's power led directly to the founding of Credit Suisse in 1856. The official story of Credit Suisse's founding emphasizes a simple motivation. Swiss banks wanted to finance railway development without allowing French banks to exert influence over the process. But this misses the deeper truth. What was really happening was this. Switzerland's most powerful men had recognized that coordinating massive infrastructure development required a specialized financial institution. Credit Suisse was co-founded by Escher and a handful of other prominent men, along with support from German and other international investors. But despite this distributed founding, everyone involved understood who was in charge. Escher became the chairman of the board. The bank's purpose was explicitly stated: to mobilize capital for railway development. The bank's actual purpose, as it developed, was to channel Switzerland's financial resources according to Escher's vision of how the nation should modernize. In the years immediately following Credit Suisse's founding, the institution became the central nervous system for capital in Switzerland. If you wanted to build a railway, you went to Credit Suisse. If you wanted to invest capital, Credit Suisse told you where it would be most profitable. Escher, as chairman, directed all of this. He had, in essence, created a system where he didn't have to request permission for projects. Instead, he could simply present projects to a bank he controlled, raise the capital, and present the government with infrastructure that was already under construction. The method here reveals Escher's fundamental genius. He wasn't the wealthiest man in Switzerland, he wasn't the politician with the most direct authority, but he had positioned himself at the intersection of three separate power systems: political influence as a prominent National Council member, financial control as chairman of Credit Suisse, and technical expertise through his demonstrated success with the Northeastern Railway. Someone wanting to move power through any of these systems had to go through Escher. Between 1856 and 1870, Switzerland's railway network expanded dramatically. By 1870, the nation had over 2,000 kilometers of railways. Switzerland had transformed from a geographically fractured collection of cantons into an integrated economic zone. The transformation was staggering, and at almost every step, Escher's fingerprints were visible, not because he built the railways himself, but because he had created the financial and political infrastructure that made their construction possible. But success created a new challenge. Switzerland was becoming connected, yes, but it was connected primarily internally. What about external connection? What about linking Switzerland's relatively isolated economy to the broader European marketplace? This is where Escher's ambition reached towards something genuinely unprecedented: a tunnel through the Alps. The Gotthard Pass had been a crucial trade route for centuries. Caravans had crossed it for hundreds of years, but the pass was only traversable in summer. Winter snow made it impassable for months. This seasonal barrier had protected Switzerland's economy but also imprisoned it. And for Switzerland to fully join the European economy, this barrier had to be overcome. In the 1860s, Escher began to imagine something that every engineer said was impossible: a railway tunnel boring directly through the Alps beneath the Gotthard Pass. The tunnel would need to be at least 15 kilometers long, making it the longest tunnel in the world by an enormous margin. No tunnel of that length had ever been attempted. The technical challenges seemed insurmountable. Water would flood into the shaft. Rock would collapse. Workers would die in the darkness. The financial challenges seemed equally impossible. Who would pay for such a massive undertaking? How much would it cost? Estimates ranged from 50 million francs, an amount that represented a significant percentage of Switzerland's national wealth. No single investor, no single nation could fund this alone. But Escher saw what others couldn't: that if Switzerland built this tunnel, it would become the crucial link between North Europe and South Europe. Italy, Germany, and France would all benefit enormously. If Escher could convince these nations to share the cost, the tunnel became feasible. If he could position Switzerland as the crucial middleman, Switzerland would benefit disproportionately. This is where innovation meets ruthlessness. Escher began, in the mid-1860s, to conduct international negotiations with the governments of France and Italy. He proposed a solution: let Switzerland build the tunnel, but have France and Italy share the costs through railway agreements that would give both nations access to Swiss territory. It was diplomatic genius. He convinced nations with opposing strategic interests to support the same project by explaining how the same project benefited them in different ways. By 1871, Escher had managed to create an international agreement and secure enough financing commitments to make the Gotthard Tunnel possible. The project had moved from science fiction to engineering reality. But now came the part that nobody wanted to think about. Somebody had to actually dig through a mountain. Somebody had to descend into darkness and move 15 kilometers of rock, 1 cubic meter at a time. And that somebody would not be Alfred Escher. Credit Suisse wasn't merely a bank in the traditional sense. To understand Escher's genius, you must understand what it actually was. It was a machine for directing capital according to a single man's vision of the future. This is the most controversial aspect of Escher's legacy, and it's the part that most histories gloss over with vague descriptions of financial innovation. When Credit Suisse was founded in 1856, the explicit purpose stated in founding documents was specific to finance railway development. But the implicit purpose, understood by Escher and the other founders, was something more profound. They were creating an institution that could accumulate capital from conservative investors and deploy it for ambitious infrastructure projects that no single investor would fund alone. Here's how it worked. A wealthy merchant in Basel might want to invest 50,000 francs, but building a railway required millions. The merchant couldn't fund a railway alone, so instead he invested in Credit Suisse. Credit Suisse accumulated these investments from hundreds of wealthy individuals and institutions. Suddenly you had millions under management. Escher, as chairman, then directed this capital towards specific projects. The genius was in the opacity. When Escher proposed a project, investors didn't need to approve it individually. They had already approved it implicitly by investing in the bank. The bank's charter gave management broad authority to pursue infrastructure development. This meant Escher didn't need constant approval to change strategy or pursue new projects. He simply needed to show that investments were profitable and growing. And they did grow. Credit Suisse's balance sheet expanded dramatically through the 1860s and 1870s. By 1870, the bank had accumulated assets equivalent to millions of Swiss francs, an enormous concentration of capital. The bank then used this capital as collateral to borrow even more capital from international investors and other institutions. This is a principle Escher understood intuitively. Leverage amplifies power. The controversial part of Escher's banking philosophy was this. He was willing to invest in projects with uncertain returns if those projects aligned with his vision of Switzerland's future. A traditional banker would have rejected many of the railway projects Escher championed. Too risky, insufficient near-term profitability. Escher rejected this logic. He was willing to subsidize railways in less profitable regions because he believed these investments would pay off in longer-term economic development and political integration. This created a moral and political problem that remains relevant today. Whose money was Escher risking when he made these bold investments? It wasn't his own. It was the accumulated savings of thousands of investors who had deposited money with Credit Suisse, expecting it would be managed conservatively. Escher was essentially using other people's capital to finance his vision of Switzerland's future without necessarily asking their permission. This practice, using depositors' money for speculative infrastructure projects, would cause serious scandals in later decades. But in the 1860s, it worked. The railways that Escher funded through Credit Suisse generally became profitable. Investors saw their wealth grow. The Swiss economy boomed. Escher's reputation as a financial genius was established. The second critical aspect of Escher's banking strategy was internationalization. Escher understood that a small nation bank could only grow if it could access international capital. So Credit Suisse, from its founding, cultivated relationships with German, French, and Italian banks. Escher personally conducted negotiations with these institutions. He convinced them that supporting Credit Suisse's projects was in their interest because the projects would integrate Switzerland economically with their nations. By the late 1870s, Credit Suisse had become genuinely international. German investors held significant stakes. The bank had representatives in major European cities. This international network would later make Credit Suisse one of Switzerland's most important connections to the broader world economy. The bank had become not merely a Swiss institution, but a genuinely European one, which was precisely what Escher intended. The third controversial aspect of Escher's banking philosophy was his attitude toward democratic accountability. As chairman of Credit Suisse, Escher reported to a board of directors. But this board was largely composed of Escher loyalists, men who had benefited from his projects and had reasons to trust his judgment. Real disagreement was rare. When board members questioned Escher's decisions, they could be marginalized. One critical decision made by Escher, to invest heavily in the Gotthard Tunnel despite its enormous risks, might have been rejected by a board with stronger democratic representation. But perhaps the most important aspect of Escher's banking strategy was something most historians miss entirely. He used the bank as a mechanism for wealth concentration. As Credit Suisse grew, Escher's personal shareholdings in the bank also grew. By the 1870s, Escher was personally wealthy in a way that went far beyond his initial inherited advantages. He had turned inherited privilege into accumulated fortune through his control of a major financial institution. He was becoming immensely rich, not through any deception or scandal, but through managing other people's capital in ways that benefited both the bank and himself. There's a technical term for this: principal-agent conflict. Escher was the agent managing money on behalf of principals, investors. But Escher's personal interests weren't always identical to investors' interests. Sometimes they aligned perfectly, sometimes they diverged. The investors couldn't constantly monitor Escher's decisions, so they had to trust him. And Escher's track record suggested that trust was warranted. But this raises the deeper question that haunts Escher's entire legacy. Did he build Credit Suisse to serve Switzerland's future, or did he use Switzerland's future to build Credit Suisse? The answer is probably both. The two were genuinely aligned in his mind, creating institutions that coordinated capital for infrastructure development and concentrating control of those institutions in his own hands were not contradictory goals. They were the same goal pursued simultaneously. By 1870, Escher had built something unprecedented. A man in his early 50s with extraordinary political influence, 34 years of parliamentary service, control of the nation's largest financial institution, and a track record of successfully executing massive infrastructure projects. There was no formal authority that gave him this power. Nobody had appointed him to rule Switzerland. But through financial and political positioning, he had accumulated power so complete that his proposals generally became reality. This was the peak of his dominance, and it was at this exact moment that Escher made his final and most ambitious decision: to commit all available resources to drilling a hole through the Alps. What happened next would define his legacy, consume the final years of his life, and cost nearly 200 lives. By 1870, Switzerland's railway network connected most major cities. The infrastructure that Escher had championed was complete in most respects. But Escher understood something crucial that most people missed. The real value of Switzerland's railways wouldn't be internal. It would be international. Switzerland sat perfectly positioned between wealthy industrial regions. Zurich was close to Germany. The southern cantons were close to Italy. The western regions were close to France. If Switzerland could become the crucial hub where trains between these regions passed through, Switzerland would benefit enormously from trade and transit fees. But this required one additional project. The mountains that protected Switzerland also divided it. The Alps were an enormous barrier to north-south commerce. You could build railways through valleys. You could route trains across passes. But during winter, the passes became impassable. The Gotthard Pass, which had been a major trade route for centuries, could only be reliably crossed during summer months. A railway that became unusable for 6 months every year was a railway that couldn't carry international commerce reliably. The solution was obvious to any person willing to think about it boldly enough. Bore through the mountain instead of going around it. Create a tunnel so long it would penetrate the Alps from north to south. This tunnel would create a route that was passable year-round, regardless of weather. It would make Switzerland the crucial hub connecting North Europe to South Europe. The problem was that every competent engineer in the world said this was impossible. A tunnel 15 kilometers long, the longest existing railway tunnel in the world, was less than 3 kilometers. No one had ever attempted anything remotely close to this. The technical problems seemed insurmountable. How would you ventilate a 15-kilometer tunnel? How would you manage the enormous water pressure? How would workers survive in darkness for that long? The costs would be astronomical. Estimates ranged from 50 million to 100 million francs, which represented potentially 5 to 10% of Switzerland's annual national product. But Escher wasn't interested in what was reasonable. He was interested in what was necessary. And he had become convinced that Switzerland's future depended on this tunnel. In 1869, Escher held a secret meeting with representatives from France and Italy. He proposed a radical solution to the financing problem. Instead of Switzerland alone bearing the cost, all three nations would share the financial burden. France and Italy would benefit enormously from a route that allowed commerce to flow between them, through Swiss territory. Switzerland would benefit from becoming the crucial junction point. Wouldn't it be more efficient for all three nations to share the cost and the benefits? The negotiations were extraordinarily complex. France and Italy had recently been at war with each other. Italy had just unified, and French-Italian relations were tense. Getting these nations to cooperate on anything required diplomatic skill of the highest order. But Escher possessed something that moved mountains, literally and figuratively. He had a reputation for competence. He had successfully executed the Northeastern Railway. He had built Credit Suisse into a powerhouse. When Escher told the governments of France and Italy that he could build this tunnel if they agreed to share costs, these were not theoretical claims. Escher had demonstrated the ability to execute major projects. Between 1869 and 1871, Escher conducted negotiations that led to treaties. Italy agreed to contribute funds. France agreed to contribute funds. Swiss Parliament approved the project. In 1871, the Gotthard Railway Company was officially formed, with Escher as chairman. Construction contracts were awarded. Engineers were hired. And in the fall of 1872, workers began to descend into the Alps with tunneling equipment. The innovation of the Gotthard project was remarkable. Escher hired some of Europe's most advanced engineers. They designed 2 approach shafts, one from each end, that would allow workers to dig from both directions simultaneously. They brought in explosives and primitive drilling equipment. They recruited thousands of workers, primarily from Italy and Switzerland, many of them impoverished men from rural areas with no alternatives. The pay was better than they could make elsewhere. A worker on the Gotthard Tunnel might earn 2-3 francs per day, a wage that seemed substantial to men from peasant villages. But the conditions were catastrophic. The workers descended into darkness, working by lantern light. The rock was extremely hard, harder than most tunnels being dug elsewhere in Europe. Progress was measured in meters per month, not meters per day. By 1873, it became clear that the project was going to take far longer than initially estimated. Original estimates had suggested the tunnel could be completed in 8 to 10 years. Updated calculations suggested 12 to 15 years might be more realistic. This meant the project would consume enormous amounts of capital for far longer than originally planned. The costs began to escalate dramatically. Here's where Escher's political skill became crucial. As costs mounted and timelines slipped, there was political pressure to abandon the project. Conservative politicians and businessmen questioned whether Switzerland should be spending such enormous sums on a single infrastructure project. Banks other than Credit Suisse began to question whether they should continue lending money to a project that might not be completed for over a decade. Escher did something remarkable. He personally toured the construction site repeatedly. He descended into the tunnels. He walked through the darkness and saw the workers laboring in conditions that would horrify modern observers. And he told everyone who would listen that this project would succeed. His personal faith in the project became its strongest selling point. If Escher, a man who had never failed at a major project, believed in the Gotthard Tunnel, perhaps investors should continue supporting it. But Escher's faith came at an enormous personal cost. Between 1874 and 1878, he worked himself near to death. He maintained his position as chairman of Credit Suisse, while also serving as chairman of the Gotthard Railway Company. He continued to serve in the National Council. He conducted international negotiations. He supervised construction details. He managed investor relations. All of this simultaneously. His health deteriorated visibly. Former colleagues reported that by 1876, the strain showed. Escher looked decades older than his actual age. In 1878, Escher suffered a serious illness. He developed severe infections and fever. For weeks, his survival was uncertain. He eventually recovered partially, but his health never truly returned. His doctors advised him to reduce his activities. Escher ignored them. The Gotthard Tunnel was approaching its critical final stages. The 2 approach shafts were getting close to breaking through to the central tunnel. The tunnel was nearly complete. Escher refused to step back. Throughout this period, workers continued to die. The construction methods of the 1870s were primitive. Water pressure in the tunnel caused flooding. Explosions killed men. Rock slides trapped workers in darkness. Diseases like typhus spread through the worker camps. Nearly 200 men were killed or mortally injured during the tunnel's construction. Most were Italian workers from the poorest regions of northern Italy. Their names were rarely recorded. They became statistics in a project that was too important for anyone to stop over what would later be called acceptable losses. Escher knew about these deaths. He received reports, but he never wavered from the project. The deaths were tragic but necessary. This was the cost of progress. This was what it took to move a nation forward. These were workers who, for all the risks, were earning better wages than they could anywhere else. They had chosen to come to the Alpine tunnels. The risks were known, even if not fully acknowledged. By 1880, it was clear that the tunnel would finally be completed. The two approach shafts had broken through to each other. Workers were clearing the final sections. The engineering challenge that everyone said was impossible had been overcome. The Gotthard Tunnel would exist. Trains would pass through the Alps year-round. Switzerland would become the crucial junction between North and South Europe. But Escher's health was failing. The strain of years of intense work, the worry about the project, the personal responsibility he felt for every worker who died in the darkness. All of this was consuming him from within. He was still in his early 60s, but colleagues who knew him well understood that he was dying. He was determined to see the tunnel opening before he died. This became his obsession. Hold on. Don't let go. See this project completed. Complete one final vision before the end. The desperation in this drive reveals something crucial about Escher's psychology. He needed these projects to outlive him. He needed to build monuments. He needed to create institutions that would remain after he was gone. The actual mechanics of tunnel boring in the 1870s were primitive by modern standards, but sophisticated for the time. The approach used at Gotthard relied on a simple but brutal principle. Drill holes into rock, fill those holes with dynamite, ignite the explosives, and remove the broken rock. Then repeat. This process would be repeated thousands upon thousands of times until a 15-kilometer tunnel had been created. The timeline would be approximately a decade, assuming no catastrophic setbacks. When workers began descending into the tunnels in late 1872, the general public had no idea what they were witnessing. This wasn't a spectacle like building a bridge or an above-ground railway. It was dark, underground, invisible. The only evidence that something remarkable was happening existed in newspapers that occasionally published updates from the construction site. Most Swiss citizens had no idea that thousands of men were descending into darkness to drill through a mountain. The workers themselves knew what they were doing. The work was dangerous, dirty, and exhausting. A typical workday began before dawn. Workers assembled at the tunnel entrance. There were eventually two main approach shafts, one from the north at Gotthard and one from the south at Airolo. They descended into the darkness carrying tools and explosives. Below ground, they worked in teams, each team responsible for expanding the tunnel by a few meters. The air was thick with dust from the explosions. Water constantly threatened to flood the excavation. Let's be specific about the deaths because they matter. When people discuss the Gotthard Tunnel, they often mention that many workers died and leave it at that. The actual number was approximately 199 deaths, according to official records kept by the company. This understates the true cost, because many workers who suffered severe injuries were simply sent home to die without ever being officially recorded as casualties. Additionally, death was often blamed on disease or accident, rather than on the inherent hazards of the project itself. The deaths had several primary causes. First was water pressure. As workers dug deeper into the mountain, they eventually reached sections where underground water was pressing against the rock. When they broke through, water would rush in at tremendous force. Men were sometimes swept away and drowned. Others were trapped by flooding and suffocated in the darkness. The pressure of the water was so intense that it would erupt into the tunnel with violence comparable to a burst dam. Second was explosive accidents. Dynamite was being handled and used by men, many of whom had limited experience with explosives. Detonations would sometimes occur unexpectedly. Men would lose fingers, hands, arms. Some were killed immediately by explosions. Others died later from infections that inevitably followed severe injuries in conditions where sanitation was nearly impossible. Third was rock slides and collapses. The mountain was unstable in places. Sections of tunnel would collapse under their own weight, trapping or killing workers beneath them. These collapses were sometimes unpredictable. Sometimes they were preceded by warning signs that nobody recognized until it was too late. Fourth was disease. The tunnels were damp, cold, and poorly ventilated. Men worked in these conditions for months. Respiratory infections were endemic. Typhus swept through worker camps repeatedly. Cholera appeared occasionally. These diseases killed more workers than any single catastrophic accident, but they were slower, less dramatic, less likely to appear in newspaper reports. Fifth was exhaustion and malnutrition. The work was brutally physically demanding. Workers often received inadequate nutrition. The combination of extreme physical exertion and poor diet wore men down until their bodies simply gave out. Men in their 30s would die of conditions that suggested they were far older. The worker composition deserves attention. The vast majority of workers were from Italy, thousands of them from the poorest regions of northern Italy. Italy had just unified in the 1860s, but unification had created economic disruption in some regions. Young men from rural villages in Piedmont and Lombardy saw the Gotthard construction as an opportunity, better paid jobs than what was available at home, a chance to escape agricultural poverty. There were also Swiss workers, but far fewer. Swiss workers could demand higher wages, and they had alternative employment. Escher's project needed workers desperate enough to accept the risks and the wages offered. This meant overwhelmingly relying on Italian migrants who had limited options. The camps where these workers lived were basic. Barracks were constructed near the tunnel entrances. Food was provided, bread, soup, sometimes meat. Living conditions were crowded and unsanitary. Disease spread easily. Injuries that occurred underground often led to infections because the camps lacked proper medical facilities. A worker might be injured deep in the tunnel, carried to the surface, and then die of infection in a crowded barracks without ever receiving proper medical treatment. Remarkably, there was no organized worker protest or resistance to the conditions. There's no record of workers going on strike or demanding better safety measures. This silence deserves reflection. Why didn't workers rebel? Part of the answer is desperation. These men needed the wages. Going on strike meant losing income and being replaced by other desperate workers. Part of the answer is that worker organization didn't really exist in this period. Switzerland had very weak labor movements compared to some other nations. Part of the answer is that the danger was somewhat hidden. Workers knew the work was dangerous, but the full scope of the risks probably wasn't entirely clear when they arrived. By 1875, 3 years into the project, approximately 50 workers had died. This number would double, then nearly quadruple, over the remaining years of construction. By the tunnel's final year, 1881, the death toll was visible to anyone who looked. But by then, the project was so close to completion that stopping seemed unthinkable. The tunnel was already a tremendous achievement. Abandoning it now would waste all previous sacrifice. This is where Escher's role becomes morally ambiguous. He knew about the deaths. He received regular reports. He visited the construction site and saw the conditions. Contemporary accounts describe him descending into the tunnels and walking through areas where men had recently died. He would have seen the injuries, men with missing limbs, men barely able to continue working. He would have spoken with workers and heard their stories of hardship. And yet he never slowed the project. He never implemented new safety measures that might have cost additional time or money. He never temporarily stopped work to improve conditions. He simply continued. The project was too important. Switzerland's future was at stake. Individual deaths, tragic as they were, could not be allowed to stop progress. This reveals something crucial about Escher that most histories downplay. He was capable of horrifying moral indifference when it came to individual human suffering, if the suffering served his vision of the greater good. He wasn't a villain in the sense of enjoying others' pain. He was something perhaps more dangerous, an idealist willing to sacrifice human lives for abstract principles about national progress. By 1880, the tunnel was nearly complete. The two approach shafts had broken through to each other. The final sections required clearing rock that had been loosened by explosions from both directions. By early 1881, the two sections of tunnel had been connected. A person could now walk from Goschenen in the north to Airolo in the south, through 15.003 kilometers of tunnel, the longest tunnel in the world by an enormous margin. The tunnel's official completion created a moment of genuine triumph, but for Escher, it was tinged with darkness. His health had collapsed. The illness he had suffered in 1878 had fundamentally weakened him. Now, in 1881, as the tunnel neared completion, Escher was visibly dying. He had pushed his body far beyond its limits. The stress, the responsibility, the constant activity, all of it had consumed him. Friends and colleagues urged him to rest. His doctors said he needed to stop working immediately. But Escher had one final goal. He wanted to see the tunnel officially opened. He wanted to stand in this achievement before death claimed him. The tunnel would be formally inaugurated on May 22, 1882. Would he live to see it? The official inauguration of the Gotthard Tunnel on May 22, 1882, was a spectacle of European importance. This wasn't merely a Swiss celebration. Representatives from France, Italy, Germany, and other European nations came to witness the opening. The ceremony captured the imagination of the continent. Newspapers across Europe covered the event. The tunnel was, without question, one of the great engineering achievements of the 19th century. Escher attended the inauguration despite his failing health. Contemporary accounts describe him as visibly weakened. He could barely walk unassisted. But he was present. He saw the tunnel he had championed, negotiated, funded, and driven to completion. He stood at the tunnel entrance, the northern entrance at Göttingen, and acknowledged the crowd. Photographs from the event show an elderly man, face aged beyond his 63 years, observing what he had made possible. The ceremony followed a pattern traditional for such events. Speeches were delivered. Dignitaries praised the engineering achievement. Trains were prepared to make the ceremonial first runs through the tunnel. A special train departed from Lucerne, carrying government officials and invited guests. The train entered the tunnel at Göttingen and emerged, 6 minutes later, at Airolo. The journey that would have taken hours by mountain pass was completed in minutes. The practical significance of the Gotthard Tunnel was immense. Trains could now move between Switzerland and Italy year-round. The Alpine barrier that had constrained commerce for centuries was finally overcome. The tunnel became the gateway for international trade. Within months, regular service was established. Trains carried goods, mail, and passengers from Germany through Switzerland to Italy daily. The economic impact was substantial. Swiss railway companies benefited from increased transit traffic. Credit Suisse, which had financed much of the project, saw tremendous returns. Switzerland began to accumulate wealth from its position as the crucial transit hub between northern and southern Europe. The transformation Escher had envisioned was becoming reality. But there was a darker dimension to this triumph that most celebratory accounts ignored. Nearly 200 workers were dead. The memory of these deaths would eventually be memorialized. In 1882, sculptor Vincenzo Vella created a monument called Victims of Labor that showed workers laboring in the tunnel, capturing something of their sacrifice. But in the moment of the tunnel's opening, the deaths were largely forgotten in the celebration of achievement. For Escher personally, the inauguration represented both triumph and swan song. He had built what he set out to build. His vision of Switzerland's future had been realized. But the achievement had consumed him. Everyone around him could see that his time was limited. Colleagues described him as moving toward death, as if walking toward an inevitability that he had accepted. What happened in the 7 months between the tunnel's inauguration in May and Escher's death in December was the slow collapse of a body pushed beyond its limits. He attempted to maintain his position as chairman of Credit Suisse, but he could barely function. He attended some parliamentary sessions, but with obvious difficulty. He spent increasing time at his estate, Belvoir, in Zurich. Visitors reported that he seemed to have withdrawn from the world, as if the energy that had driven him for decades had simply been exhausted. Contemporary medical records suggest that Escher suffered from what we might now diagnose as a combination of conditions: severe stress-related illness, possibly tuberculosis, which was rampant in the 19th century, infections related to untreated wounds or injuries, and general systemic failure of organs worn down by decades of overwork. Medical treatment in 1882 was limited. Doctors could offer little beyond rest and basic care. Escher's body, having been driven to extremes, simply began to fail. By November 1882, his condition had worsened dramatically. He developed fever, which persisted despite all medical intervention. He became increasingly delirious. The inflammation in his body created what 19th century doctors called carbuncles, serious infections that developed on his skin and caused excruciating pain. By early December, his doctors understood that death was approaching. The question was merely timing. On December 6, 1882, Alfred Escher died at his Belvoir estate. He was 63 years old. The funeral was enormous. All of Switzerland's political leadership attended. International dignitaries came to pay respects. The newspapers published lengthy obituaries. Escher's death was treated as the loss of a national figure, which he was. The man who had shaped Switzerland's modernization for 34 years was gone. What's striking about the aftermath of Escher's death is how quickly his influence began to fade. The institutions he created, Credit Suisse and the railway network, continued, but Escher himself became a historical figure rather than a living influence. By the 20th century, very few people knew his name. He had become almost completely forgotten by the general public, even though every Swiss train traveling the Gotthard Tunnel was, in a sense, Escher's legacy. The tunnel itself became his most enduring monument. For decades, it remained the world's longest railway tunnel. When it was finally surpassed by the Seikan Tunnel in Japan in 1988, the Gotthard Tunnel had held that distinction for 106 years. When the modern Gotthard-based tunnel was completed in 2016, a tunnel so much longer and more advanced that it made the original tunnel seem like a preliminary sketch, the original tunnel still remained in use, testimony to Escher's engineering vision. Credit Suisse continued to grow after Escher's death, becoming one of Europe's most important financial institutions. It would eventually become one of Switzerland's big banks, entities of such scale that their failure could threaten financial systems. But the bank lost something when Escher died. It lost the visionary who had shaped its purpose. Over subsequent decades, Credit Suisse became increasingly focused on pure financial profit rather than infrastructure development. The bank that had been founded to finance railways and national development gradually became an investment bank, pursuing returns wherever they could be found. This transformation, from infrastructure bank to pure investment bank, would have troubled Escher, though he never lived to see it. By the time Credit Suisse collapsed in 2023, more than 140 years after its founding, it bore little resemblance to the institution Escher had created. The bank had become a speculatively focused institution that had participated in various scandals, including money laundering controversies, interest rate rigging, and the excessive risks that led to the 2008 financial crisis. The original purpose, financing infrastructure development for national good, had been completely abandoned. The tunnel's opening and Escher's death represent the climax and resolution of his story. He had achieved his ambition. He had transformed Switzerland. He had built institutions and infrastructure that would outlive him by decades, or in the case of the tunnel, by centuries. But he had paid an enormous personal price, and the human cost, nearly 200 workers, had to be measured against the achievement. In the years immediately following the Gotthard Tunnel's opening and Escher's death, Switzerland experienced an economic boom. The tunnel worked better than even the most optimistic projections. Trade flowed between north and south. Switzerland, positioned as the crucial hub, accumulated wealth from transit fees and the development of new industries in regions that had previously been isolated. But this economic success created a kind of historical amnesia about the costs. The deaths that had occurred during construction were gradually forgotten. Worker names weren't recorded. The poor Italian migrants who had died in the darkness didn't leave families who could demand justice or compensation. They came from villages in Piedmont and Lombardy, made their wages, and if they survived, returned home. If they died far from home in the darkness. What few people understood at the time, and what historians would only fully appreciate a century later, was that the death toll had been catastrophic. Roughly 199 deaths represented an enormous loss of life, but the surviving workers who suffered injuries added to that human cost significantly. Men who lost fingers or hands, or who developed permanent injuries from explosions, often couldn't work afterwards. These survivors received minimal compensation or support. They returned to their villages as disabled men in societies with no disability support systems. Some begged, some starved. The true human cost of the tunnel extended far beyond the officially recorded deaths. Moreover, the tunnel's success created a particular form of moral hazard for future projects. Since the tunnel had been completed despite its enormous cost in lives, and since Switzerland had benefited economically from the tunnel, it seemed to confirm that sacrificing worker safety for infrastructure achievement was justified. Future infrastructure projects in Switzerland and elsewhere would emulate this model, accept worker deaths as an inevitable cost of progress, justify it through economic benefits, and move on. The cultural impact in Italy was different than in Switzerland. In Italy, the Gotthard workers became a subject of artistic attention. The loss of nearly 200 young men from poor villages to a foreign construction project created a kind of trauma in the regions they came from. Artists and writers began to grapple with this loss. Vincenzo Vella's 1882 sculpture, Victims of Labor, captured something of this. The sculpture shows workers in a moment of exhaustion, digging deep in a tunnel, with a child looking back at the viewer. The sculpture became a meditation on what national progress cost in human terms. Over the century that followed, the memory of the tunnel's human cost gradually faded entirely. By the mid-20th century, very few people knew how many workers had died building the tunnel. The tunnel itself had become so routine, just another piece of infrastructure, that its history seemed irrelevant. Trains passed through it thousands of times daily, but nobody was thinking about the men who had died creating it. This forgetting is understandable but troubling. We tend to remember great achievements and forget the cost of achieving them. We see bridges and railroads and think about their utility, not about the workers who died building them. We celebrate the Panama Canal without spending much time on the tens of thousands of laborers who died during its construction. We admire the pyramids without contemplating the enslaved workers who built them. Progress and human cost are separated in our cultural memory. For Alfred Escher specifically, the separation was dramatic. He is remembered in Switzerland as the railway king who modernized the nation. School children learn about his achievements. There are statues of him in Zurich. There are streets named after him. But very few Swiss people today know about the nearly 200 deaths that occurred during the tunnel's construction. The costs have been completely separated from the achievement. This raises profound questions about how we should judge historical figures. Should we evaluate Escher purely on his achievements, the infrastructure he built, the institutions he created, the modernization he drove? Or should we weigh those achievements against the human costs? Is it possible to do both simultaneously in a way that doesn't whitewash either the achievement or the cost? The standard historical approach has been to do both but separately. Escher's biography will mention that unfortunately many workers died during construction, and then move on to discuss the technological achievement. This approach treats the deaths as a tragic but inevitable aspect of 19th century progress, regrettable but not ultimately indicting of Escher himself. But a more probing moral analysis suggests that Escher deserves significant responsibility for these deaths. He was the man driving the project. He knew about the deaths. He had the authority to slow construction, improve safety, or even stop the project. He chose not to do any of these things. His decision to prioritize completion over worker safety was a deliberate choice, not an inevitable consequence of the times. This is not to say Escher was evil. He almost certainly believed that the tunnel was important enough to justify the costs. He likely convinced himself that the workers had agreed to the risks and were being compensated fairly. He may have believed that any delay would result in ultimate failure and, paradoxically, in greater suffering. But none of these rationalizations changed the basic fact. He allowed nearly 200 people to die when he had the power to prevent or reduce that death toll. The Italian impact of the tunnel's construction deserves more attention than it usually receives. The tunnel was built by Italian workers at Italian expense in human terms, but the benefits primarily accrued to Switzerland and Germany. Italy benefited economically, yes, but the cost-benefit analysis was asymmetrical. Italian families lost young men. Italian villages lost their strongest workers, and the wealth generated by increased trade benefited Swiss banks and investors far more than Italian workers' descendants. This brings up the question of colonialism and imperialism that historians have only recently begun to attach to the Gotthard story. The tunnel was presented as a joint international project benefiting all parties, but in reality, it was a project where Swiss money, accumulated through Escher's financial innovations, was leveraged to attract Italian workers who had few alternatives. The workers' labor was extracted, and their deaths were accepted. This follows a pattern similar to colonial projects, where wealthy nations extracted resources and labor from poorer regions. By some historical accounts, Escher's family wealth itself was partially derived from colonial labor. The coffee plantations in Cuba operated by enslaved workers. So the capital that funded the tunnel, which was built by exploited Italian migrant workers, had been partly accumulated through slavery. The continuity is disturbing. Wealth extracted through slavery funding projects, built through migrant worker exploitation, that benefited wealthy European capital. The Gotthard Tunnel sits at the intersection of multiple systems of exploitation. Modern historians are beginning to grapple with these uncomfortable connections. For most of the 19th and 20th centuries, these aspects of Escher's story were completely ignored. He was celebrated purely as an innovator and modernizer. The moral complexities were invisible or actively suppressed. But as we develop more sophisticated ways of understanding history that incorporate the perspectives of marginalized people, workers, migrants, colonized peoples, the Escher story becomes more complicated and more troubling. What does this mean for how we judge Escher? It suggests that we can't simply celebrate him as a visionary while ignoring his moral failures. It suggests that his achievements, while genuine, were purchased at costs that he was not fully honest about. It suggests that the progress he drove for Switzerland was unequally distributed. Some benefited greatly, others bore disproportionate costs. But it also doesn't suggest that Escher was simply evil or that his achievements should be discounted entirely. He genuinely did transform Switzerland. The tunnel genuinely did contribute to European development. Credit Suisse genuinely did help Switzerland modernize. The question is whether achievements secured through such costs are ultimately justified. This is not a question with a simple answer. It's a question that each generation must grapple with as our moral understanding evolves. Alfred Escher died in December 1882. The Gotthard Tunnel opened in May 1882, so he lived to see his final project inaugurated. He died, believing that his life's work was complete, but the true legacy of that work unfolded over the subsequent century and a half in ways he could never have predicted. The immediate impact was clear. Switzerland became wealthy. The tunnel that Escher had championed became one of Europe's most crucial transportation arteries. By 1890, just 8 years after the tunnel opened, Switzerland's economy had grown dramatically. The nation that had been among the poorest in Europe at the beginning of the 19th century was beginning its transformation into one of the wealthiest. Credit Suisse, the bank Escher had founded, grew into one of the world's most important financial institutions. In the 20th century, Credit Suisse became known for banking secrecy, a service that made it attractive to wealthy people around the world, including, notoriously, people seeking to hide wealth from their governments or to launder money obtained illegally. The bank that Escher had founded to finance Swiss infrastructure had become an institution that helped wealthy people hide their wealth from taxation. This transformation of Credit Suisse represents a kind of moral drift. Escher had created the bank with a specific purpose: to finance national development. By the late 20th century, the bank had become a tool for private wealth concentration and secrecy. It had lost its original purpose almost entirely. When Credit Suisse collapsed in 2023, it was not because of failed infrastructure investments, but because of excessive speculation, mismanagement, and exposure to risky financial instruments. The railway network that Escher had championed became the foundation for Swiss prosperity. Switzerland's famous train system, known worldwide for reliability and efficiency, is built on the foundation of Escher's vision and the infrastructure he created. Every train traveling through the Gotthard Tunnel today is, in a sense, riding on Escher's legacy. This is a remarkable achievement. Few people can claim to have created infrastructure that remains in daily use 150 years later. But Escher's other great initiative, the educational system, also deserves attention. In 1854, he was instrumental in founding the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, the Polytechnic, later ETH Zurich. This institution became one of the world's most prestigious technical universities. Escher understood that building infrastructure required trained engineers and technical experts. By creating this institution, he ensured that Switzerland would have the expertise to modernize continuously. ETH Zurich produced engineers and scientists who became world-renowned. The institution became a center of innovation. Albert Einstein taught there. Many of the scientists and engineers who shaped the 20th century were trained at ETH Zurich, an institution that Escher had helped establish. This educational legacy may be more important than the Gotthard Tunnel itself, though it's typically overshadowed in historical accounts. The modern rediscovery of Escher's legacy has been mixed. In Switzerland, he remains a respected historical figure, though his name is known primarily to specialists and historians. Tourists visiting the Gotthard Tunnel have no idea who Escher was. His statues in Zurich are visited by very few people. His political innovations, The creation of structures where private capital could be leveraged for public good are studied by historians but largely forgotten by the general public. Outside Switzerland, Escher is almost completely unknown. Ask a random person in Europe or America if they know who Alfred Escher is. Almost nobody will know. Yet Escher's influence shaped their world. The railways that integrate Europe, the banking systems that move capital across borders, the educational institutions that produce technical experts. All of these have roots that trace back to Escher's innovations. The question of how to properly evaluate Escher's legacy remains contested. In Switzerland, the official narrative celebrates him as a visionary who transformed a poor, isolated nation into a modern, prosperous state. Historians acknowledge that his methods were sometimes ruthless and that he accumulated enormous personal power, but the overall assessment tends to be positive. The ends justified the means. Switzerland benefited. But contemporary historians increasingly question this narrative. They point out that the benefits of Escher's modernization were unequally distributed. Wealthy people like Escher became vastly richer. Workers who built the infrastructure benefited less directly. The human costs of projects like the Gotthard Tunnel were substantial and are now recognized as morally troubling. The role of exploited migrant labor in building Swiss prosperity is increasingly difficult to ignore. There's also the question of whether Escher's concentration of power was actually positive for Switzerland's development. He argued that coordinated vision was necessary for modernization. But was it? Would Switzerland have modernized anyway through more distributed democratic processes? Would the results have been better or worse? We can never know the counterfactual, but the question is worth asking. The Gotthard Tunnel itself has taken on new symbolic meaning in recent decades. As Switzerland has become increasingly integrated into the European Union, though not formally a member, the tunnel has become a symbol of Switzerland's role as a connector and bridge. The new Gotthard-based tunnel, opened in 2016, is a modern successor to Escher's 19th century achievement. It's longer, more advanced, and built with far better worker safety protections. The new tunnel is a technological triumph of the 21st century, but the existence of the new tunnel also raises questions about the original. If a new, more advanced tunnel was necessary just a century and a half later, how enduring was Escher's achievement really? The answer is that it was remarkable for its time, but inevitable that it would be surpassed. This is true of most technological achievements. They represent the cutting edge for a moment, and then become superseded. The measure of achievement isn't permanence, but rather its impact in its time. For Escher, the impact was enormous. He lived in a specific historical moment, the mid-19th century, when industrialization was transforming Europe. He understood what his nation needed and positioned himself to provide it. He created institutions that proved durable. He built infrastructure that remained functional for over a century. He shaped his nation's development in profound ways. That's a remarkable legacy, even if we acknowledge the moral costs and complexities. The final judgment on Escher must include several elements simultaneously: recognition of his genuine achievements in modernizing Switzerland and creating institutions that became foundational to Swiss prosperity, acknowledgement of his moral failures, particularly his indifference to worker suffering, understanding of his role in exploitative systems that extracted labor from poorer migrants, and appreciation for his intellectual innovations in creating financial structures that could coordinate private capital for public purpose. He was not a hero in the simple sense. He was a complex figure who achieved remarkable things through methods that we would now recognize as deeply problematic. He accumulated power that was unprecedented for someone not formally in government. He used that power to reshape his nation, and his reshaping benefited his nation enormously, even though the costs were borne disproportionately by those with the least power. Looking at his life through the lens of the 21st century, we can see both what made him successful and what was wrong with his approach. He showed that one intelligent person, properly positioned and given time, can reshape institutional systems. But he also showed how easily moral concerns can be subordinated to grand visions. He showed how power can accumulate to the point where one person can determine a nation's direction. And he showed how the costs of achievement are often hidden until historians dig them out decades later. So we've seen how one man, born into privilege in 1819, Zurich, spent a lifetime accumulating power and using that power to transform an entire nation. Alfred Escher was not the wealthiest man of his time. He was not the highest-ranking government official. Yet by the 1870s, he had become perhaps the single most influential figure in Switzerland, a power that flowed not from any single position, but from his strategic positioning at the intersection of finance, politics, and infrastructure development. His life demonstrates something important about power in the 19th century, and perhaps in all centuries, that formal authority is less important than structural positioning. Escher held elected office, yes, but he had far more power as chairman of Credit Suisse and the Gotthard Railway Company than he ever had as a member of parliament. This insight reveals something about how power actually moves through society. It's not primarily about titles or official positions. It's about positioning yourself where capital flows, where strategic decisions are made, where networks converge. Today, more than 140 years after Escher's death, his legacy manifests in multiple ways. Every train passing through the Gotthard Tunnel is a continuation of his vision. The Swiss railway system, that tourists praise for its reliability, is built on foundations he laid. Zurich, one of the world's leading universities, exists partly because of his initiatives. The banking systems that move capital across Europe were influenced by Credit Suisse's model. These are not small legacies. These are infrastructure and institutions that shape millions of lives daily. But when you step back and look at the full picture, Escher's story is also deeply troubling. Nearly 200 workers died building his greatest achievement. Many more were injured and received minimal support. Migrant laborers were exploited because they had no alternatives. The benefits of Switzerland's modernization flowed overwhelmingly to wealthy people like Escher himself. The burdens fell on those with the least power. And the historical narrative that developed around Escher's achievements completely marginalized this human cost. The real lesson here isn't simply that progress requires sacrifice. Many great achievements do require sacrifice, but progress also requires us to be honest about who bears the costs and who reaps the benefits. It requires us to ensure that those bearing costs are not exploited or abandoned. It requires us to build safety protections even when they complicate or delay projects. It requires us to recognize workers as human beings with dignity, not as fungible inputs to be expended. Modern Switzerland has moved beyond Escher's era in many ways. Swiss labor laws protect workers. Safety standards are rigorous. Migrant workers have rights and protections that were unimaginable in Escher's time. The modern Gotthard-based tunnel, built more than a century after the original, was completed without deaths, a remarkable achievement that shows that major infrastructure projects can be completed without sacrificing worker lives. Yet Switzerland still bears some troubling continuities from Escher's era. The nation still has one of the world's largest concentrations of wealth. Switzerland still functions as a financial center where wealthy people hide wealth. The banking secrecy that allowed Credit Suisse to accumulate power, financial secrecy, is still a defining feature of Swiss finance, though it has been somewhat reduced in recent decades. The inequality that Escher's modernization created, where the wealthy accumulated enormous fortunes while workers received minimal compensation, remains a defining feature of Swiss society. Whether we like it or not, Escher shaped our world. The institutions he created, the infrastructure he championed, the financial innovations he pioneered, all of these continue to structure how capital moves and how nations develop. Every train journey through the Alps, every transaction at a bank descended from Credit Suisse, every Swiss technology student studying at ETH Zurich is participating in systems Escher created or influenced. This doesn't mean Escher was purely positive or purely negative. It means he was complex. He was a man of genuine vision and genuine moral failings. He achieved remarkable things and achieved them through methods we would now recognize as deeply problematic. He understood power in sophisticated ways and used that understanding to reshape institutions. But he also concentrated power in ways that were undemocratic and unaccountable. He was willing to accept human costs that modern societies would find unacceptable. Looking at Escher's life from our modern vantage point, we can recognize several crucial lessons. First, that individual agency matters enormously. One smart, determined person, properly positioned, can shape systems far larger than themselves. This is inspiring when applied to positive ends, but it's also troubling when applied to systems that concentrate power undemocratically. Second, that progress and human cost are not separate. They're connected. We cannot celebrate Switzerland's modernization without acknowledging its costs in worker suffering. We cannot praise the Gotthard Tunnel without remembering the nearly 200 workers who died building it. Infrastructure achievements and human costs must be held together, not separated. Third, that historical narratives shape how we understand our world. For most of the past century and a half, Escher's story was told as a narrative of triumph, with the costs mentioned briefly and then forgotten. Only recently have historians begun to complicate this narrative. This complication doesn't make Escher a villain. It makes him human, complex, and worthy of serious moral reckoning. When you zoom out to the broadest perspective, Alfred Escher was a man of his time. He operated according to the values and assumptions of the 19th century. He was ruthless in ways we would now find unacceptable. He accumulated power in ways we would now consider anti-democratic, but he also showed how individual vision, properly executed, can transform societies. The question that remains is whether we can learn from his achievements while rejecting his methods. Can we develop infrastructure and institutions without sacrificing workers? Can we concentrate capital without concentrating power undemocratically? These are the questions that Escher's legacy forces us to grapple with. If you made it this far through Escher's story, you've engaged with one of history's most complex figures. The question that should haunt you now is this: how do we build the future without repeating the mistakes of the past? In the comments below, I want to know, do you think Escher's achievements justify the costs? Were nearly 200 worker deaths an acceptable price for Switzerland's modernization? Or should we judge him more harshly for his indifference to suffering? There's no simple answer, but the conversation matters. If you enjoyed exploring how individual agency shapes nations, how financial systems can be weaponized for vision, and how historical narratives can hide moral complexity, you'll probably love the companion video we've created on the history of Credit Suisse's rise and collapse. Credit Suisse's 2023 failure was dramatic, but understanding how it became too big to fail requires understanding Escher's original vision and how it drifted over 167 years. I'll link that video below. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into historical figures who shaped the world in complicated ways. We're building a channel dedicated to understanding power, ambition, and the human costs of progress through nuanced historical narratives. Thanks for learning about Alfred Escher with us. His story is Switzerland's story, and in many ways it's Europe's story too.